fact, when I left Saddleback back in 2001 to go to New York City, I thought that would be it. I had this great experience at Saddleback of basically helping Rick and helping him lead conferences. I wasn't a conference speaker. I would just help him put the conferences together. And it takes a whole team of people to make something like this work. And I was just one of those people in the background. So when I went to start a church, I thought that's it. And about a year into the church, Rick called. He said, hey, would you come speak at a church planting conference? And I said, no, I'm not going to come speak it. I'm not even sure my church plant's going to make it. And I said, if we ever grow to 500 and you want me to come speak, call me back. And I thought, that's it. I never thought the Journey Church in New York would ever grow to 500. If you know our story, we launched with 110, but then I quickly, over the next several months, grew it down to 35. I thought, sure, we were going to be out of business our first Christmas, but somehow or another, we turned around and applied all these church growth principles by folks in this room, like Dr. McIntosh and Hunter and others in this room. And so, we turned it around. But 4 or 5 years in, we did hit 500. And not Rick, but one of his right-hand guys remembered that, Nelson, you said if the Journey ever hit 500, you would come speak at a church planter conference. And it was a bit like this conference. There were 4 or 5 other speakers, and I was the low guy on the totem pole. And they said, you're going to have about 2 hours to speak, but Rick decided to teach longer, and so my 2 hours went to an hour and a half, which went down to an hour 10, and I eventually had 50 minutes to speak. Well, the problem was I'd prepared 2 hours worth of teaching, and on what I thought were some really interesting subjects, like your call to be a church planter, how to raise money as a church planter, and I didn't want to cut those lectures, so I just recorded them. And I gave my 50 minutes that I had, and then I gave out free CDs to anybody who wanted a CD on how to do fundraising and things like that. Well, while I was at Saddleback, 5 years prior to that, we had completed a research project. And I don't have permission to share this project with you because it was a proprietary project, but I can tell you the results. And the results were, out of Rick's big purpose-driven conferences, we discovered that 10% could take the conference material and just run with it. They were these high achiever, 10% go-getters, and they would come to a conference like Rick, remember these 2,000 purpose-driven church conferences, 2,000 people, 3,000 people, and all that. Well, 10% would just take it and run with it. We also discovered, much to our chagrin, that about 50% wouldn't do anything with it. They just went home and put the notebook on the shelf. And then we found there was this middle of about 40%. And basically what we learned from this project is those 40%, with the right training, with the right encouragement, with what today we would call coaching, they would be able to implement what was being taught in this conference. So here I am, I find myself now 5, 6 years later, and I'm speaking at this church planting event, and I say to the main speaker at the event, not Rick, but another speaker, I say to him, hey, we ought to try this coaching thing, because my gut is, out of 300 church planters, 10% will be able to go and rapidly implement everything we're teaching, and they're just go-getters. 50% are probably going to do nothing with what we talked about, particularly my part. But what about that middle 40? Would it be possible for us to have an ongoing relationship with those 12, 15, or 20? Do the numbers make sense, what I'm saying here? So we launched a coaching network out of that church planting event. Now, the way I started producing resources, by the way, was those little CDs turned into people calling and wanting to buy them on our website. And today we have like 100 different resources that we've developed over the years. In fact, I quit doing stuff on church planting. I just give it all away now for the church planters. But I started doing this coaching, and my role in the very first coaching network, so we had 15 or 20 church planters sitting around the table. We'd hand selected them and said, okay, you sit around the table. My role was to keep the time. That was my role. This other guy was the expert. He was the guy that knew all the stuff. And so I would just say, hey, I think it's time for us to take a break, and here's the handouts that the other guy promised, and I would kind of keep the network going. After the second network, he came to me and he said, Nelson, this is killing me. He said, I don't think I'm cut out for this. He said, I'm just dying in the room. And he was a great presenter, but it just wasn't his gifting. He was just wore out. He said, I tell you what, why don't you take the next session? And I'm like, what? I don't know what I'm going to talk about. He's like, well, don't you have those CDs on funding? Do something on fundraising. So I took the next session, and I did a whole session on fundraising. And I found it really energizing. Then he said, okay, do the next session. So the way it began is I would lead, and then he would just speak into it and run commentary and give authority. Well, out of that, I started doing other coaching networks. And over the next year, I did a coaching network in Southern California, a coaching network at home. in New York City, a coaching network in Atlanta, a coaching network in Phoenix, a coaching network in Tampa, and probably some other city that I've forgotten at this point. But over the course of the next 3 or 4 years, in coaching networks, I impacted about 200 church planters. And after that, something began to happen. The people who were applying were no longer church planters. There were more established church pastors who were applying to be a part of the coaching network. And by this point, I'd written my first book, which was on church planting, and my second book, which was on assimilation, the one Bob referenced, Fusion, had been out for a little while. A lot of people were using that, and they wanted to be a part of the coaching network. And so I opened up for the first time back in 2006 or so, the coaching network to be more than church planting. And for the next couple of years, it was 20% church planters, 80% traditional churches that were trying to turn around, to use the terminology here that we're talking about. So I did that for several years, and I would spend 1 week a month away from the church. So I was still preaching 3 weeks a month at the church, and then 1 week I would travel. And I would start in California, then I'd work my way back across the country doing these coaching networks. And I would lead them from 9 in the morning till 3:30 in the afternoon, which was as late as I could go in most places and still get a flight to the next city to be there the next day. And I did that up until we coached about 500 pastors. And somewhere in there, it was just killing me. You know, trying to get a 6 o'clock flight out of Atlanta back to New York. I said, enough of this. There's got to be a better way to do this. And so we opened it up and we started doing what we were calling at that time telecoaching. And it was kind of like a GoToWebinar. If you've ever done a GoToWebinar, I'm sure you've done that. So people would call in on their phone and they could see my computer screen. And we did that for a couple of years, and that really caused things to change. And I won't get into all the changes that we've made over the last several years unless you're interested. But suddenly, in 1 year, we coached as many people as we had coached in the previous 4 or 5 years. And I didn't have to fly to California and Arizona and Texas and Atlanta and Tampa and all of that. And we opened it up. And up until just recently, I continued to do an in-person network in New York City. And one of the things I tell folks who are trying to get started in coaching is if you can't do a coaching network in your own hometown, you probably can't fly somewhere to do one either. And so I always thought the real power of what I was doing in coaching was the fact that I was constantly coaching 20 or 30 pastors from Metro New York City. And then that would allow me to have the integrity, if you will, or the authority to then coach people in other places around the world. So today, here we are with almost 2,190 pastors who have gone through my coaching process.